a concession road outside Port Perry, Ontario, there is a low industrial building set well back from the pavement. For years, it carried no sign. Anyone who needed to find it was told to watch for a loudspeaker basket mounted on a pole at the end of the driveway. That was the address. Inside, the same building was turning outline array cabinets that would hang in Beijing's National Stadium, the Bird's Nest, built for $80,000, and above the crowd at Strahov in Prague, where nearly 70,000 people came through the gates over 2 nights. Others went to Bogota, to Barcelona, to Seoul. The company is Adamson Systems Engineering. Its neighbors, by and large, had no idea what it made. This is not the story of a Canadian company that failed. It is the story of one that won nearly everywhere except at home, and of a founder who made that trade deliberately after he already had a name worth trading. The building without a name begins on the other side of the country, with a man who had the right idea and none of the right machines. Welcome back to Forgotten Canadian Hi-Fi and Audio Empires, where we trace the companies this country built, sold to the world, and then stopped talking about. If that sounds like a story worth keeping, subscribe. It costs you nothing, and it keeps these episodes coming. And keep one thing in mind here: forgotten does not always mean gone. His name is Brock Adamson, and he did not arrive in audio through a school or through a company. He arrived through a box he had to build himself. He was about 16, living near Toronto, when a stereo system arrived in the family home carrying far more power than a house required. The woofers came without enclosures. By his own account, he has never been able to explain exactly why he took it on. But he went after the problem and built the cabinets himself. That habit, going after a thing single-mindedly without waiting for training or for permission, runs through everything that follows. In the late 1960s, he left Ontario and headed west. In Edmonton, he fell in with a group of musicians, and by his own dry summary, it went downhill from there. What that actually meant was an apprenticeship no institution in the country was offering. He met people working in every corner of the music and audio trades: engineers, instrument makers, and a handful of people experimenting with the first portable recording rigs. Many of them, he has said, were eccentric. They also did outstanding work. That was where his understanding of electronics began to form. His mentors pushed him toward a question much of the industry treated as settled: the relationship between what a loudspeaker does and what a human ear actually receives. He began experimenting with reflection-free measurement equipment from Bruel and Kjær, the Danish instrument maker whose gear was, at the time, close to the only serious option in existence. And he started building, not concert systems at first, studio monitors. This is the part of the story that is easy to move past, and it should not be. In the 1970s, a Canadian builder making a studio monitor had almost nothing to check his work against. The measurement systems that would later become ordinary did not yet exist in any form he could put on a bench. Adamson has described the situation plainly. They had to work with their ears. Consider what that means in practice. Picture a control room in a converted space somewhere in southern Ontario. Low ceiling, a mixing desk shoved against the long wall, a pair of monitors sitting on the bridge above it. The builder listens. Something in the low mid-range sounds thick. So he changes the cabinet. He listens again. Better. But he has no way of knowing what he just fixed. The thickness might have been the enclosure. It might equally have been the wall a meter behind the monitor, throwing a reflection back into the room slightly out of step with the direct sound and reinforcing one narrow band of frequencies. What engineers call coloration. Both faults sound identical from the chair. Only one of them is in the loudspeaker. So the builder tunes the speaker until it is correct in that room. The moment it leaves that room, the correction becomes the error. Every fix is a guess, and every guess is welded permanently into the product. That is the ceiling measurement removes. Adamson would spend the better part of a decade trying to reach it. And by the time he understood what he needed, he was living in the wrong half of the country to get it. By 1978, he was living in Vancouver, and it was on the West Coast that the work turned professional. He connected with Rocky Mountain Sound and began meeting regularly with Jeff Berryman, a computer scientist and loudspeaker designer who at the time worked for a competitor. Berryman, Adamson has said, was a great mathematician. The two of them traded ideas, while Adamson built high-power prototypes for the company, and in time he became a partner in the business. It did not hold him. In 1983, he left to form a company under his own name, Adamson Systems Engineering. The date carries a small footnote worth stating plainly. The company's own published material has used both 1983 and 1984 over the years, and the earlier date appears in most industry records. 3 years later came the test that made his name locally, and it arrived as a rescue job. Expo 86 opened in Vancouver, and Adamson was brought in as site audio consultant on one of its exhibits. What he found, by his own account, were systems already installed at 11 venues that were badly suited to what those rooms were being asked to do. He tore into all of them. Roughly 200 hours of labor compressed into a week and a half. Everything came off, he has said, with one exception. Margaret Thatcher's opening address, because she was notoriously reluctant with a microphone. It was his first work at commercial scale, and it worked, which makes what happened next look, at first glance, like a retreat, because in the background, running underneath all of it, Adamson had a materials problem he could not solve where he was standing. He had been prototyping diaphragms and drivers. Specifically, he had been developing loudspeaker cones made from Kevlar, an aramid fiber, the same family of material used in body armor, chosen because it is enormously stiff for its weight. A cone has one impossible job: move air hard without flexing. Stiffness resists the flexing. Low mass keeps it quick. Kevlar offered both at once, and in the early 1980s, almost nobody was building cones out of it. Building them, though, required machinery and process technology that Western Canada did not have. Everything Adamson wanted was concentrated in the manufacturing centers of the Great Lakes Basin. Presses, tooling, materials suppliers, the whole industrial base that Ontario had and British Columbia did not. So he crated it all up and shipped it east into a warehouse in Pickering. The move had a second reason, and it mattered as much as the first. Much of his immediate family was already in Ontario, including a brother-in-law who happened to be the Canadian distributor for the American amplifier manufacturer Crown, and who happened to own one of the first analyzers Crown ever put out. Adamson did not move east and then find the instrument. The instrument was already sitting there, in the hands of a relative, and it was part of why he went. He had spent close to 15 years building loudspeakers by ear because there was no alternative. What was waiting for him in Ontario was not a market, and it was not a customer. It was a suitcase that ran CPM, and it changed what he was able to hear. The instrument was a Crown TEF-10, and by his own description, it was a big suitcase running the CPM operating system. Clunky, he has said, but a powerful thing to have in that moment. What it replaced was a sweep generator synchronized to a chart recorder. The gap between those two devices is the gap between the first half of Adamson's career and the second. The TEF units implemented a technique developed by the American engineer Richard Heiser called time delay spectrometry, and it could do something no chart recorder could. It sorted sound by when it arrived. A loudspeaker's direct output reaches the measurement microphone first. A reflection off a wall or a ceiling travels farther and lands a few milliseconds behind it. To the ear and to every instrument Adamson had used until then, those two arrivals fused into a single result. Time delay spectrometry pulled them apart. That answered the question that had defeated him in every room he had ever tuned. The fault was in the loudspeaker, or the fault was in the building. Now something on the bench could tell him which. Consider that problem at full scale in a Canadian hockey arena. An oval of hard surfaces, a curved roof, seating on all four sides, and an ice sheet that reflects nearly everything striking it. Sound leaves the system. A fraction of it reaches the people it was aimed at. A great deal of it hits the roof and returns late, smearing consonants into the seats across the ice. Tune that by ear, and the result is a negotiation with the building, renegotiated in every new city. Measure it, and the building finally holds still. The instrument brought him something else as well. It brought him people. In the late 1980s, the acoustician Floyd Toole telephoned him. The two had never met, but Toole had heard he owned a TEF-10 and told him there was a gathering in Ottawa he needed to attend. In the room were Heiser himself, along with Stanley Lipschitz, John Vanderkooy, and Laurie Fincham. Adamson has described watching Heiser and Lipschitz go at each other as being like watching a tennis match without ever having held a racket. One of them filling a blackboard with equations, the other swinging a second blackboard into place to start his own. Toole also put him in touch with Dr. Earl Geddes, and that connection changed the products. Geddes worked on waveguide theory. A waveguide is a shaped passage mounted in front of a compression driver, and its job is to decide where the sound goes. To hold energy inside a defined angle, instead of letting the driver spray it wherever the physics happens to send it. Geddes' research concerned what actually occurs inside such a passage, how air moves through it, and what happens at its boundaries. Adamson has said the fundamental principles underlying that theory were extremely solid, that it changed how the company designed waveguides, and that it fundamentally affected how it would later conceive the sound chambers inside its line arrays. The product that came out of it was the MH225, the first Adamson loudspeaker to pair the company's own Kevlar compression driver with an acoustic waveguide. It put the company on the map globally in the late 1980s and early 1990s. There is a photograph from that period showing MH225 arrays flown left, center, and right over a concert in Laguna Beach, California. It is worth noticing where that photograph was taken, because the pattern it establishes never breaks. The engineering carried forward whole, the patented phase plug, the concentric rings and the way their output sum. The boundary considerations governing how a wave passes through the device, all of it, Adamson has said, was carried directly into the line array environment, which is where the industry was going. By the late 1990s, the line array had become the default choice for touring. Rather than clustering boxes and aiming them in different directions, a line array hangs cabinets in a vertical column so their outputs couple into one tall wavefront, energy that holds together as it travels and lands on the audience instead of the roof. It is the direct answer to that hockey arena. North American manufacturers, Adamson's own included, were still focused on conventional approaches. VDOS came out of France, where his largest distributor, DV2, was based. And he was aware of its impact because it was competing hard for sales in that market. He was fixated on building a horizontal array, he has said, before deciding to build a vertical one instead. The mid-range still defeated him, and he would not copy anyone else's answer to it. The answer arrived in a Toronto club. He and another engineer were trading off, mixing a reggae band, and he was in the middle of explaining to the man why the thing could not be done when he understood how to do it. He drew it on a napkin. 93 days later, by his own account, the company shipped its first Y-axis line array. At its center sat the patented collinear drive module, and the result stands as one of the first line arrays designed and manufactured in North America. Adamson has described a production crew working so far into the night that people simply slept at the warehouse. One night, he says, he used a pizza box as a pillow and woke with a slice of cheese stuck to his face. But a vertical array cannot be honestly measured indoors. It has to be hung at its working height outdoors, with open distance in front of it and nothing nearby to argue with the result. The company did not have that. The array worked. What it did next was stranger than the product. It went looking for an empty field. The place the company ended up is a township called Skewgog, and the address is a concession road outside Port Perry, roughly an hour northeast of Toronto, past the point where the suburbs give out and the land goes to farms. Pinning down when it arrived takes some care. Records place Adamson at the Port Perry facility no later than 2008, and an industry profile written around 2019 described the company as having been in the town for close to 15 years, which points to a move somewhere in the middle of the 2000s. What that dating establishes matters more than the exact year. The Y-axis had already shipped. The patents were already filed. The company was already selling into Europe. Adamson did not go to Port Perry to start something. He went there after he had already won. And he went for a reason that would have sounded absurd to any ordinary manufacturer. He went for the emptiness. Space, he has explained, was the real motivation for putting the headquarters away from the auditory distractions of major highways and industrial noise. And full-scale outdoor testing could then be performed at will. Rapid prototyping, in his account, requires the best software and machinery combined with the luxury of space, room to accumulate multiple physical prototypes, and room to assemble and measure arrays. He has put it more bluntly in public since. He does not like being jammed in and surrounded by the city. In Port Perry, there is room to measure, test, and compare big loudspeaker systems outside. Read that against the problem at the end of the last chapter, and the logic closes. A vertical array cannot be honestly evaluated in a building. It has to hang at working height with open ground in front of it. Every competitor in the business was solving that with rented sites and travel days. Adamson solved it by buying the field and putting the factory beside it. The trade was explicit, and it was not free. He purchased the ability to hear his own products accurately, and he paid for it in visibility. A company on a concession road outside a farming town does not get walked past. It does not get noticed by the trade press on their way somewhere else. It does not get dropped in on. What it does get is arrays hanging in open air, in daylight, as often as the engineering requires. And then the products started going out. By 2008, the company had appointed C-Sound, based in Barcelona, as its exclusive Spanish distributor, and Spain became the first testing ground in Europe for the beta launch of a program the company called Project Energia. The new E15 system premiered at the Low Cost Festival in Benidorm. In 2013, Imagine Dragons carried E15 arrays through North America and Europe on the Night Visions tour. The system engineer's explanation of the choice is the most revealing sentence in the whole record. The boxes were light while still putting out a great deal of power, which let the tour reach the volume it needed even in venues where hanging a long array was not an option. The tour played rooms seating anywhere from 800 to 17,000. In 2014, a system built around Energia arrays went into Estadio El Campín in Bogotá. 18 E15 and 4 E12 enclosures per side. In 2017, the arrays reached a scale that is difficult to hold in the mind. At Strahov in Prague, nearly 70,000 people came through the gates across 2 nights. 15 E15 per side on the main hangs, 15 more per side on the side hangs, 12 E12 per side on the delay towers, and 32 E219 subwoofers flown per side. 32 subwoofers per side, suspended above a crowd. That same year, the system went into Beijing National Stadium. The Bird's Nest, capacity 80,000, the largest stadium in China. 18 E15 per side on the mains, 15 more per side on the sides, and 8 arrays of 9 to 12 compact enclosures flown from the roof overhangs to cover the entire upper bowl. A company that had gone looking for an empty field was now filling the largest rooms human beings build. Through all the years those numbers were being posted, the building itself did not change. There was no sign at the road. Visitors were told to watch for a loudspeaker basket mounted on a pole beside the driveway. That was how people found the place. A reporter who made the trip found that locals, at least the ones he spoke to, had no idea professional audio equipment was being built in their backyard. By the company's own description, Adamson is one of the largest employers in Skugog Township, with more than 100 skilled craftsmen and women working in disciplines running from design and development through to production. A trade profile from roughly the same period put the headcount at about 120, one of the largest employers in the township. Unidentifiable from the road. The people who did know were specialists. In September 2008, the Toronto section of the Audio Engineering Society came out to the Port Perry facility for a technical session on active compensation of nonlinear loudspeaker distortion. It returned 10 years later, in October 2018, for a tour of the manufacturing floor, an outline of the technology roadmap, and a presentation on the company's certification program. Both times the phrase used to introduce Adamson was the one it used for itself, Canada's most recognized exporter of loudspeaker technology for the pro-audio sector. Most recognized? By a professional society that had to schedule a field trip to see it. What made those rooms possible was a manufacturing decision that ran against the direction the rest of the industry was moving. By its own account, the company is highly vertically integrated, raw material purchased locally and processed on site, with engineering, woodworking, transducer design, and final voicing all carried out in the same building. The proprietary work came out of that arrangement. Aramid mesh cones and waveguides descended directly from the MH225. The network built on top of it ran outward. A distributor in Spain, a distributor in China, a distributor in Korea, sales and support staff in the United States, Germany, and Thailand. In 2015, Ultra Music Festival Korea turned a stadium field in Seoul into what was billed as the country's largest outdoor club, drawing more than 100,000 people across 2 days, with 12 E15 and 2 E12 per side on the main stage. Every one of those appointments made an Adamson system easier to buy somewhere else. None of them made it easier for a Canadian to stand in front of one. There is a list of installed rooms the company points to, and it rewards reading slowly. The Paradiso in Amsterdam, the Hawke's Bay Arts and Events Centre in New Zealand, Studio 104 in Paris, the Claude Debussy Theatre in Cannes, Olaf Schallen Concert Hall in Trondheim, Norway, the Graceland Soundstage in Memphis, Tennessee. 6 rooms, 5 countries, not one of them in Canada. A caveat is owed. That list is promotional, assembled to impress buyers, so it shows what the company believed was worth showing rather than a complete registry, which is rather the point. When Adamson reached for its most persuasive rooms, not one of the ones it chose was at home. To hear the loudspeakers this country was building, a Canadian had to buy a ticket to a show, and then not be told what was hanging above the stage. The factory, meanwhile, kept outgrowing itself. In 2017, the company doubled the size of its manufacturing and research facility, citing 3 years of rapid growth, and gave the entire addition over to production and R&D while rebuilding the original space around product development and education. Industry accounts from the years just after describe a footprint near 75,000 square feet, with further excavation already being planned. The company's current material puts the headquarters at 100,000. Those figures come from different years and different hands, and they are better read as a direction than as a measurement. The direction is not in dispute. A factory that had to be rebuilt around its own growth. Arrays over 80,000 people in Beijing. And in the country where every one of those cabinets was assembled, the company remained something close to a rumor. Then every room in the world closed at once, and a company that sold nothing but rooms found out exactly what it had built. Go back to the suitcase. A young builder on the West Coast, tuning loudspeakers by ear because there was nothing else to tune them with. Moving east, in part because a relative in Ontario happened to own one of the first analyzers Crown ever shipped. A machine running CPM, the size of a piece of luggage, borrowed. That instrument was the difference between guessing and knowing, and for years, it sat on a bench in Ontario as the single most valuable object in the operation. Now look at where the measurement went. The CS series cabinets carry their own amplification, their own digital signal processing, and Milan-ready AVB networking, audio and control traveling down a single cable under an IEE standard with redundancy built in, VGT packages, 8 transducers, amplification, a networked DSP endpoint, and auto-lock rigging into one enclosure. The system's optimization function applies broadband coverage correction without adding latency, and Array Intelligence software designs, deploys, monitors, and corrects the whole array from one screen. The suitcase did not get smaller. It got distributed. Every box in the hang now contains a piece of it, reporting back. That is the through line of 40-odd years in this business. And it runs in a straight line from a borrowed analyzer to a self-monitoring array. The company has not slowed down. In 2025, it introduced the XG integration amplifiers, offering up to 16 kilowatts in a compact rack format with native Milan AVB over a single cable, alongside the MG10 stage monitor and continued expansion of the IS series for permanent installation. In May 2026 came VGX, the largest and most powerful full-range enclosure the company has built, using 3 mid-range transducers and 3 high-frequency compression drivers on a newly designed coaxial mid-high assembly with a stated dB and a half of additional headroom per element over VGT, and 2 new subwoofers alongside it. At Infocom that June, the judging panel's assessment was blunt. Nobody does large-format line arrays better. The training programs have gone with it. Adamson certified courses continue to expand internationally with a rollout across Indonesia beginning in 2026. And it is all still made in Canada. Not assembled here from imported subassemblies. Designed, prototyped, machined, wound, built, and voiced in the same building, on the same road, beside the same field. For the audience that came to this channel through home audio, that fact deserves one line of context. The Canadian loudspeaker story is usually told as a story of loss. Brands sold, engineering teams dissolved, production moved offshore, names surviving on products their founders would not recognize. Adamson is the outlier. It kept the factory, kept the drivers, kept the founder, and kept the ownership. And it did it in the most brutally competitive corner of the entire industry, selling to buyers who compare systems with instruments and have no sentiment whatsoever. So what was actually lost? Not the company, not the engineering, not the jobs, not the address. What was lost was the recognition. And the loss ran in one direction only. An Adamson array has hung over crowds in Bogota, Prague, Seoul, Amsterdam, Cannes, Trondheim, Beijing, and Memphis. In Canada, the company remained something the trade knew, and the public did not. A named specialist traveled out to Port Perry to see, and everyone else walked past on a highway they never had reason to leave. That was the trade. A field in exchange for a reputation at home. The founder made it deliberately, with a product already proven. And by every technical measure, it was the correct call. The arrays got better because he could hear them properly. And the country that built them never quite learned that it had. Which is the reason this episode exists. Forgotten is not always a synonym for finished. Sometimes a company is forgotten while it is still shipping. Forgotten in exactly one place, the one where the boxes are made. Whether that ever changes is not a technical question. The engineering has never needed defending. What it would take is for Canadians to learn that the largest rooms on Earth are being covered by cabinets built an hour up the highway from Toronto, on a road most of them could not name. The sign is up now. It went up sometime around the end of the last decade. Late by any reasonable measure for a company already hanging in the bird's nest. Drive out from Toronto on a clear winter morning, and you can find it. Past the last of the subdivisions, out where Scugog Township opens into fields, a low building sits back from a concession road. A shipping door rolls up. A finished array element comes out on a dolly, black, close to the size of a chest freezer, and the man pushing it steps down into gravel and frozen mud. Behind the building, the field is empty and white and open all the way to the tree line. The reason the company is here at all, waiting for the next thing that needs to be hung in the air and listened to. And out at the road, at last, there is a sign with a name on it. In January 2019, Adamson Systems Engineering announced that Mark Bertrand had been appointed Chief Executive Officer, taking over global operations from the Port Perry headquarters. Brock Adamson became chairman. Bertrand arrived as an industry veteran with previous experience at TC Group and a number of audio brands brought in Adamson's own later phrasing, to focus on strengthening the sales infrastructure. On his appointment, Bertrand described the partner network as one of the most passionate he had encountered and credited close collaboration for considerable growth in key territories. Read at the time, it was an ordinary and sensible transition, a founder in his 70s moving to the chairman's seat, a commercial specialist taking the operational load. It is the succession most engineering-led companies eventually attempt, and it is the succession most of them find difficult, because the thing being handed over is not a set of processes. It is a set of judgments about sound that nobody wrote down. 4 years later, the arrangement was rebuilt. In 2023, the company announced it had completed a strategic management initiative, creating 5 new positions in preparation for Brock Adamson's return as Chief Executive Officer. Those additions followed the hiring of a controller and an ERP specialist the previous year, both drawn from outside the audio business. One from automotive, one from pharmaceuticals. Adamson's own account of the reasoning is worth taking at face value, because it is the only account there is. In 2022, he has said, the company asked itself what the ideal management team would be to fuel continued growth, and it then built that team. He described having lived and breathed Adamson from the earliest days through to the most recent factory expansion, and noted that he had brought Bertrand in to strengthen the sales infrastructure. Returning as chief executive, he said, was energizing. That is the record. It says a founder stepped back and 4 years later stepped forward again with a deeper management bench underneath him than had existed before. What the record does not say is why, and this is a point worth being careful about. No public document explains the reversal. There is no reported dispute, no stated disagreement, no announced departure framed as anything other than a change of structure. Anyone claiming to know more than that is guessing, and a company's internal reasoning is precisely the thing that does not leave the building. What can be observed is the shape. A company that had run for 36 years on one man's ear tried an arrangement without him at the center, then went back, and surrounded him with controllers, ERP specialists, production managers, and brand people. The entire apparatus a founder-run engineering shop tends to do without for as long as it possibly can. Which brings us to the thing that had been true the whole time, and that the company itself finally said out loud. Speaking around his appointment, Bertrand described the situation plainly. There was respect for Adamson in this hemisphere. From those who knew it was a Canadian brand, and from some who actually thought it was European. The company's European presence, the same profile noted, sometimes overshadowed the fact that the technology was manufactured in Canada. Sit with that for a moment, because it is the bill arriving for a decision made 2 decades earlier. Adamson bought a field outside a farming town so it could hear its own arrays properly. The engineering that came out of that field went to Barcelona, to Bogota, to Prague, to Seoul, to Beijing. The distributors who sold it were European and Asian. The trade press that covered it most heavily was European. And so the brand acquired a European accent that had nothing to do with where a single cabinet was built. Not forgotten exactly, misfiled. There is a particular cost to that, and it is not sentimental. A manufacturer whose national origin is unclear cannot draw on the thing every other national industry draws on, the assumption in its home market that buying local is a reasonable default. Adamson never had that in Canada, because Canada largely did not know the option existed. And then there is the last cost, which is the one the founder would probably feel most. Recall the napkin? A sketch drawn in a Toronto club and 93 days from that night to a shipped product, with a production crew sleeping on the floor to get it out. Now consider the launch of VGT, the company's flagship large-format array, announced in January 2024. It arrived, in the company's own words, after years of in-house development and testing. And its announcement did not open a sales campaign. It opened a pilot phase. Alfred Tyler Kane, with a handful of exclusive partners taking the system out on the road, with live demonstrations to follow across the coming year. Years of development, then a controlled pilot, then, eventually, the market. That is not decline. That is what happens when a company grows large enough that being wrong becomes expensive, and it is the correct way to launch a product that will hang over 80,000 people. But it costs the one thing the napkin bought for free. The company that could go from a bar table to a shipping dock in 93 days now moves at the speed of everyone else. Somewhere in the middle of all that, a sign finally went up at the road. Go back to the suitcase. A young builder on the West Coast, tuning loudspeakers by ear because there was nothing else to tune them with, moving east in part because a relative in Ontario happened to own one of the first analyzers Crown ever shipped. A machine running CPM, the size of a piece of luggage, size of or borrowed. That instrument was the difference between guessing and knowing, and for years it sat on a bench in Ontario as the single most valuable object in the operation. Now look at where the measurement went. The CS series cabinets carry their own amplification, their own digital signal processing, and Milan-ready AVB networking, audio and control traveling down a single cable under an IEEE standard, with redundancy built in. VGT packages 8 transducers, amplification, a networked DSP endpoint, and auto-lock rigging into one enclosure. The system's optimization function applies broadband coverage correction without adding latency, and Array Intelligence software designs, deploys, monitors, and corrects the whole array from one screen. The suitcase did not get smaller, it got distributed. Every box in the hang now contains a piece of it, reporting back. That is the through line of 40-odd years in this business, and it runs in a straight line from a borrowed analyzer to a self-monitoring array. The company has not slowed down. In 2025, it introduced the XG integration amplifiers, offering up to 16 kilowatts in a compact rack format with native Milan AVB over a single cable, alongside the MG10 stage monitor, and continued expansion of the IS series for permanent installation. In May 2026 came VGX, the largest and most powerful full-range enclosure the company has built, using 3 mid-range transducers and 3 high-frequency compression drivers on a newly designed coaxial mid-high assembly with a stated dB.5 of additional headroom per element over VGT and 2 new subwoofers alongside it. At Infocom that June, the judging panel's assessment was blunt. Nobody does large-format line arrays better. The training programs have gone with it. Adamson certified courses continue to expand internationally, with a rollout across Indonesia beginning in 2026. And it is all still made in Canada. Not assembled here from imported sub-assemblies. Designed, prototyped, machined, wound, built, and voiced in the same building, on the same road, beside the same field. For the audience that came to this channel through home audio, that fact deserves one line of context. The Canadian loudspeaker story is usually told as a story of loss. Brands sold, engineering teams dissolved, production moved offshore, names surviving on products their founders would not recognize. Adamson is the outlier. It kept the factory, kept the drivers, kept the founder, and kept the ownership. And it did it in the most brutally competitive corner of the entire industry, selling to buyers who compare systems with instruments and have no sentiment whatsoever. So what was actually lost? Not the company, Not the engineering, not the jobs, not the address. What was lost was the recognition, and the loss ran in one direction only. An Adamson array has hung over crowds in Bogota, Prague, Seoul, Amsterdam, Cannes, Trondheim, Beijing, and Memphis. In Canada, the company remained something the trade knew and the public did not. A name specialist traveled out to Port Perry to see, and everyone else walked past on a highway they never had reason to leave. That was the trade. A field in exchange for a reputation at home. The founder made it deliberately, with a product already proven, and by every technical measure, it was the correct call. The arrays got better because he could hear them properly, and the country that built them never quite learned that it had, which is the reason this episode exists. Forgotten is not always a synonym for finished. Sometimes a company is forgotten while it is still shipping. Forgotten in exactly one place, the one where the boxes are made. Whether that ever changes is not a technical question. The engineering has never needed defending. What it would take is for Canadians to learn that the largest rooms on Earth are being covered by cabinets built an hour up the highway from Toronto, on a road most of them could not name. The sign is up now. It went up sometime around the end of the last decade, late by any reasonable measure, for a company already hanging in the bird's nest. Drive out from Toronto on a clear winter morning and you can find it. Past the last of the subdivisions, out where Skugog Township opens into fields, a low building sits back from a concession road. A shipping door rolls up. A finished array element comes out on a dolly, black, close to the size of a chest freezer, and the man pushing it steps down into gravel and frozen mud. Behind the building, the field is empty and white and open all the way to the tree line. The reason the company is here at all, waiting for the next thing that needs to be hung in the air and listened to. And out at the road, at last, there is a sign with a name on it.